For 4 decades, the United States has been embroiled in a war to eradicate drugs. And as Matt Sledge points out in his piece for the HuffPost, despite a growing global presence, we are still losing the global war on drugs. Joining us now to discuss, HuffPost national reporter Matt Sledge. And in the Hangout, we have John Walsh, Senior Associate for Drug Policy at the Washington Office on Latin America, and Sean Dunnigan, a former DEA intelligence analyst and a member of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Thanks for joining me, everybody.
Sure. Pleasure. Thank you.
So, Matt, in your piece, you emphasize the large DEA presence overseas. Where exactly are we seeing these DEA agents more prominently?
Right. It would actually almost be easier to ask, where aren't these DEA agents? They're everywhere from Paris to Kabul. We have a huge presence in Latin America, particularly in Mexico, Colombia, and Peru. And we also have agents in places like Afghanistan, where they've been deployed to fight opium production, and Thailand, where they're also fighting the heroin trade.
Now, it's interesting, specifically in regards to Latin America with Mexico and with South America, we see where they move in and start changing things, we see the drug trade move into different countries where they don't really have as much of a presence yet, right?
Right. It's not all about DEA agents. We also give these countries huge amounts of money in terms of aid for law enforcement, something like $2 billion a year. But people who analyze the drug war call this the balloon effect. Cocaine and heroin production are way down in Colombia, and they've ballooned out to other Latin American countries like Peru and Bolivia. And we've also seen a lot of the momentum, if you will, in the drug war move to Mexico, which is a big reason why we've seen this huge spike in homicides there.
Now, this balloon effect, is this the only result that we're seeing from the global presence? Are there any other beneficial consequences that we've seen?
Right. Well, you know, I guess the reason we've been sold the idea that we need to send all these agents and all this money abroad is to hopefully reduce the negative consequences of drugs, both in these countries abroad and in the United States. Just looking at the United States, laying aside the issue of all this violence abroad, we've not seen the price of major illegal drugs like cocaine, heroin, or marijuana drop. And that's after 40 years of fighting this war on drugs.
Well, it's essentially gone up.
Yeah, we have seen the price of these drugs drop. Excuse me. So we haven't seen the flow of these drugs into the United States constricted to the extent that it would make it more difficult to get these.
We've seen the price drop. I mean, we've been covering the, quote, heroin epidemic around the country on HuffPost Live. We've been covering that done a number of segments about it. And we've seen the price of heroin drop as well as the purity of heroin rise. Now, this is coming from Afghanistan and from South America. What are we seeing in terms of the policing? What are the actual measures that DEA agents are using in these countries to combat?
Right. It really depends on the country that you're talking about. I discussed this with Sean and with another former DEA agent. It's really varied. In some countries, these agents can carry a gun. In others, they can't. In some countries, these agents are going out on drug raids with local law enforcement. And in other countries, they're just kind of sitting in the office, maybe doing intelligence analysis, trying to find out who the big cartels and traffickers are in any given country. So it ranges from really hands-on to other countries like, say, Russia or China, where these agents are mostly confined to a desk.
Sean, you're a former DEA agent and you served in Guatemala and Mexico. Do you think the global presence of the DEA is an effective method?
Well, no, and I thank you so much for having me on. Just as a clarification, I was an intelligence analyst with DEA. I was not an agent. But no, I mean, to answer your question, right, if we look at the metrics of success, there's no way that one could come to the conclusion that this has been that this is effective, having so many DEA personnel overseas and the other things we do overseas, but the vetted units and the money that's sent for aid for interdiction and eradication. No, it's certainly not effective. I mean, if it were effective, we would see drugs less available in the United States. We would see rising prices. We would see declining usage rates. We would see a weakening rather than a strengthening of the transnational criminal organizations that deal in drugs. And of course, we're not seeing any of that. So, no, it certainly is not an effective strategy.
Sean, you did intelligence analysis in Guatemala. What was your experience like there? What were the things that you were seeing?
Well, it's interesting to see the extent of the U.S. counter-drug footprint in a country like Guatemala that is largely dependent on U.S. aid of all kinds. We were involved in assisting the judiciary, all levels of the police, all sort of political institutions within Guatemala, trying to prop those up. And so, along with that comes a great deal of influence, right, for the United States, and I think that's one of the one of the reasons that we pursue that international policy so aggressively. I sort of see our international counter-drug efforts as sort of replacing, our more overtly military efforts during the Cold War. The Cold War evaporated. We no longer had that counterinsurgency mission throughout Latin America to exert influence in the region, and the drug war largely replaced that. And now drug funding, drug aid is sort of that mechanism of influence that we use throughout Latin America.
John, I'm curious how this presence is affecting global relations for the United States.
Well, for a long time, the U.S. is certainly the driver of this prohibitionist policy. It's sort of our strategy. We've imposed it to a large extent on the rest of the world, forced the leaders, particularly in Latin America, to follow along with that strategy or risk losing aid or running afoul of international counter-drug conventions. More recently, of course, that's starting to change. I think one of the interesting recent developments in Guatemala is a new president, López Molina, who is by no means a left-wing dove. One of his first statements after assuming office was to challenge the U.S. drug war. Of course, we see Uruguay, Mexico. I mean, so we're really, I think, starting to see a shift that eventually will lead to a critical mass where, leaders in Latin America that are, bearing the brunt of the drug war are going to challenge the U.S. effectively and really kind of move away from this law enforcement-centric prohibitionist policy towards some more progressive counter-drug strategies.
I want to talk about the more progressive counter-drug strategies in just a minute. John, you're the Senior Associate for Drug Policy at the Washington Office on Latin America. Talk to me about what you're hearing, what you're understanding about our relationship with Latin America and how that corresponds with the presence of DEA agents in some of these countries.
Well, as was pointed out earlier, the DEA is only a piece of that problem, I would say, in terms of U.S. relations with the rest of the hemisphere. Drug policy has been one of the centerpieces of U.S. policy towards Latin America now for several decades, and it has been an irritant the entire time. I think Sean is right that the changes that are happening in the region now are often in reaction to a hardline, zero tolerance, you'll do what we say approach on the part of the U.S., and countries are saying, we've done this now for decades, we've adopted your recipes, sometimes under duress, and it's not working for us. It didn't work for you, and we're going to try some new approaches. And Uruguay is, I think, the most dramatic example of that because they've passed a law that would legalize and regulate cannabis.
How has that worked out for them?
Well, so far the question is there international pressure for them to backtrack? I think within the region, if other countries aren't coming out vocally in support, at least they're not condemning it either. In other words, there's the flexibility from their colleagues in the region to go forward. They still have to write the rules for the new law, so it's premature to say how it's going to work. I think they have a good chance to make it work. And the other really interesting point is, in the past, even within the past few years, the United States might have been vocally opposed and pushed back on Uruguay and cite the international conventions as a reason why this kind of innovation could not be permitted. Well, because Colorado and Washington passed similar laws, and because the federal government is, I think, correctly accommodating those laws going forward at the local level in the U.S. is in no position now to push back on Uruguay. And I think that further opens this space for innovation, experimentation, and experimentation means, all right, well, let's learn. And the comparison isn't, are we doing better than a perfect situation, or is the comparison, can we do better than the disaster that we have now? And I think the experience will show that we can do better.
Absolutely. Matt, in your piece, you also talk about FAST teams, foreign deployed advisory support teams. What exactly are those?
They're kind of like the SWAT teams of the DEA abroad. They came about when we started to go to Afghanistan to serve as, kind of the drug arm of drug enforcement arm of our military mission there. And after they were deployed in Afghanistan, they've started to be transferred to Latin America. And a lot of this was kind of happening under the radar until just a couple of years ago in Honduras, when there was a drug raid that kind of went horribly wrong, and it appears that several civilians were killed. And there's still a lot of murkiness around exactly what happened. There was a FAST team there. There was a recent long New Yorker article about this, and we still don't have a lot of answers about what happened. But I think it's caused a lot of people in Latin America to rethink the very aggressive stance that the DEA takes in some of these countries. Very much going out on these missions, with big loaded weapons ready to enforce.
In this situation, what you're talking about here, this one situation with a FAST team, this is only really one that we know about. Is this something that we're hearing more and more happens more often?
I can't answer that. Maybe Sean can, just because he has better connections there.
Sean, are these FAST teams, why are they so problematic? Is this something that happens more often than just this one story that Matt was telling?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with another incident like that where there was a shooting of innocents. But, anytime you take what are essentially troops, right? I mean, they're agents, they're badged and credentialed agents, but they're flying with military weapons and military helicopters through what could reasonably be described as a hostile area. Bad things can happen. So I'm not familiar with another incident like that. If there were other incidents like that, I would not expect the DEA to be particularly forthcoming, just as they have not been forthcoming releasing details of the shooting in Honduras. But, invariably when you kind of set something like that up and put that in motion, it's a dangerous situation. You're creating a dangerous situation where tragedies can occur. It's incredible to think, really of the violation of national sovereignty in these countries where FAST teams operate. I mean, we would not accept a Black Hawk full of Royal Canadian Mounted Police to be flying through New York, right? But that's essentially what we're asking our Latin American and, of course, Latin American countries and, of course, Afghanistan and throughout the world. So, it's just a tactic that I think really invites more tragedies like what occurred in Honduras. And again, kind of invites that pushback against the broader American counter-drug policy.
Mm-hmm. Now, John, if we all agree, myself included, that we need a new approach, we're talking about the global level, but I think on the local level in the United States, we need a new approach in terms of this drug war. What does that new approach look like? What are the alternatives?
Well, lots of it is already being talked about and actually already happening. In the first instance, we over-incarcerate dramatically. We use incarceration as if it's a cheap and effective way to deal with the problem. It's neither. And I think there's an increasing recognition, bipartisan in this country, that we need to wean ourselves of this over-incarceration binge and find alternatives for dealing with not just users who shouldn't be locked up for using at all, but low-level, nonviolent dealers. There need to be alternatives to incarceration and strict criminal enforcement.
John, doesn't the alternatives, and take this to Matt and Sean as well, the alternatives for these low-level dealers and the alternatives for these very poor countries a lot of times is economic resources. We need alternative economic resources. The drug trade is essentially, for a lot of people, their only means to an economy.
Right, and this is something that the Obama administration, rhetorically at least, has emphasized for years. We need to build these economic alternatives. We need to create some opportunity for the poor poppy farmer in Afghanistan to grow something else instead. It's a troubled enterprise just because any economic development efforts that the U.S. Attempts to prop up are troubled. Economic development is really tough.
Also, how difficult is it to create a sustainable economic development that can in any way rival what you could make off of drug trades?
Incredible profits off of opium, usually not when you're the low-level farmer, but when you're higher up in the criminal enterprise. Another thing that I talked about with John for this piece that was really interesting to me was there's a big emphasis in a lot of drug enforcement in going after the biggest criminal groups, trying to get the most kilos on the table for that nice photo op, or for the picture where you have this big pile of marijuana bales burning up. What John suggested was that maybe instead of going after the most kilos, we should go after the most violent organizations, the most violent people, because the violence caused by these drug organizations is so disruptive.
Mm-hmm. John, I want to give you the last word as he was bringing up in a conversation that the two of you were having and going after the most violent organizations. Is that not something that we've seen in Mexico and seen the deaths skyrocket even more? Or is the drug war in Mexico as vague as it is here and in other countries?
I think we've clearly seen going after the most violent in the United States. It's not so clear that we've seen that in Mexico. Part of that formula is making it clear this is what we're doing, being transparent about it. We are going after you because you're the most violent, and if anyone wants to try to take your place, they're going to be our focus as well. The point is an acknowledgement that there's a global drug market. It will continue to exist. We can't eradicate that, but we can shape the market in ways that are less violent in particular and less harmful overall for communities. In the United States, there's been a lot of this done at the local level that has prevented violence and reduced levels of violence. In foreign affairs, the United States ought to be presenting this as a much more productive and constructive way to do drug enforcement. The problem is drug enforcement is a sort of single vision. We just have to chase the drugs. We have to stop the supply. That's not going to bring us very far. And rather than decrease violence, it's going to tend to spark it.
Well, John, thank you so much. Matt, thank you so much for joining me. And Sean as well, thank you so much for joining us. It's a conversation that I'm positive that we're going to continue having here at the HuffPost Live and on the World Post, where you can find this article. Keep watching HuffPost Live. There's a lot more coming up next.